you find things that you want to measure, suddenly you want to start measuring everything. And metrics can end up becoming the tail that wags the dog. So one of the things I really want to focus on this conversation is, how do you keep in mind the end state, or what are you driving towards? Why are you measuring? Why is it important to your organization? What are you actually hoping to accomplish? Because you can measure any number of things, and the time it will take to get good measurements for all those different dynamics of measurement will take a long time. So it's important that we be able to focus on goals, desired end state, and how metrics can inform that conversation, or how metrics can force you to start asking questions about how things are set up. How is your organization set up for success or not? What kind of technology platforms are you using? And can metrics be a useful tool to help you make decisions about your technology choices? Can metrics help you figure out how you're allocating people and resources? And does it give you insight into your existing processes? Do those need to be changed in some? So these are all the sorts of questions that I hope to get into, because whenever you start talking about DevSecOps and continuous delivery, yes, technology and tools are a very important part of that, but you're also starting to bridge the gaps between technology and the people and the processes that the technology interoperates with on a very frequent basis. And so how do you enhance those relationships between people, process, and technology? How do you make sure they work to the best of their capability, and that you're frankly getting out of your own way? So that's kind of the overview I wanted to establish here, so we can figure out, there are any number of resources online about how to measure or what to measure. I really want to push into the conversation of, once you decide that you do, then the question becomes how and the why. Some of you are familiar with DORA metrics, which I think tries to really break this down to its most simple form to help people focus on what the outcome should be. And then I want to get into a discussion around, what does DORA++ look like? What is the importance and relevance of projects like the FourKeys project, for example? And we can get into that discussion as well. But anyway, you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from the expert. So I wanted to use this as an opportunity to bridge to our esteemed guests. And why don't we start with Dina Portman. Dina, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Fantastic. Thank you for being here.
Yeah. Okay, I have a little presentation. So let's share the old screen. Awesome. Okay. I am Dina, and I'm here today to talk to you about the FourKeys project and measuring DevOps success. So to measure DevOps success, first we have to agree on what DevOps is. And there are a lot of different definitions, and this is the one that we have up on our cloud.google.com site. And it's an organizational cultural movement that aims to increase software delivery velocity, improve service reliability, and build shared ownership among software stakeholders. Awesome, great. We're all on the same page. Now, how do we know if we're doing it well? And that's where DORA comes in. DORA is the DevOps research and assessment team. And over 6 years, actually like 7 years now, lots of years, they've identified 4 key metrics that are predictive of organizational success. So that is a stronger relationship than correlation. And these 4 key metrics can be broken up into speed and stability. And on the speed side, we have deployment frequency, lead time for changes. And on the stability side, we have change fail rate and the time to restore service. Now, the research was done using surveys, which is great. If you have thousands and thousands of respondents over many, many years, over many, many different industries, and you use like really good statistics and all that stuff. If you're trying to measure your own performance over time, we run into some issues. So the pros of using a survey, and you can go on the cloud.google.com/DevOps site and take the quick check, the DORA quick check, and essentially it's a survey, and then it'll tell you like what your performance is and how you stack up against your industry, and then it'll start like guiding you and saying, here are some things that you can improve if you're interested in improving your lead time, for instance. So it's quick and easy to use. The problem is it's susceptible to bias. So depending on who is filling it out on the team, they'll probably have a different understanding of what the metrics are. And also, things like recency bias. If you had a really big outage last week and it was all over the news and your VP is really angry, then you're going to have this like really outsized understanding of what your change fail rate is. That might not actually be true. Also, it's not automatic. So we see survey fatigue. And if you're trying to like measure this over time, then people are probably going to drop off pretty quickly, and you're going to have diminishing returns from your surveys. So that is why we started thinking about using systems data. So it helps alleviate the bias. It makes it a little bit easier to measure over time. And it exposes bottlenecks, because when we really drill down into the systems data, we can start to see things, not just that, our lead time for change is really long, but we can see that we had like a day before we, there's like a day from our first commit to merging it into our main branch, but then like 2-3 weeks after that. So right away, we know where our bottleneck is, and we can, start thinking about how do we push these out faster. It also helps quantify experimental success. So if you're using a new like change approval process and you want to know whether or not this is pushing the organization forward in the ways that you care about, then you can use the metrics to to benchmark your performance now, and then after the experiment's been going on for some time, and you can say like, oh, this has actually moved the dial this much or this much. The cons is that it's more difficult to set up than a survey, and there are storage and engineering costs. So that is why we started the FourKeys project. This is an open source project. You can get to it at bit.ly/Dora-4keys. It's on GitHub. And we wanted to automate some of this data collection and parsing, because the great thing is that you have all of the data that you need to calculate these 4 key metrics. The problem is it's in like a dozen different systems. So how do we pull it all together? And what we came up with was this kind of general pipeline solution where we have the events happening in the sources where they happen. And we post all of the events to a webhook, which is, we're calling it our event handler. And then the event handler pushes the body of the event to PubSub, and each topic is a different source. So you would have your GitHub topic, your Cloud Build topic, your Tecton topic. And those go to a very, very, very tiny little ETL worker that pulls out some of the important pieces of information and puts it into a dimensional BigQuery table. So from there, we have our derived table. So that first table is just everything. And from there, we split out our tables using scheduled queries, and then that feeds into our dashboard. So digging into the tables, our raw events table should have every single DevOps event that happens, because we don't necessarily know yet at this point, like what we're going to need and how all of these things fit together and influence each other. So everything goes into the raw events table. And then we have our scheduled queries to extract out and kind of like abstract out changes, deployments, and incidents. So, the events might show like your deployment started, your deployment is in progress, your deployment failed, or your deployment was successful. So from there, we pull it out, and then we have like just one deployment row for each of like those multiple events. And getting this right is actually the challenging part. And this is like where your own business operations and logic has to come in. Like you have to understand what does a successful deployment mean for our organization? Which environment are we pushing it to? Like how much traffic are we doing canary rollouts? And so once you really like nail down like what your changes are, what your deployments are, and what your incidents are, the metrics just follow. So let's get into the metrics. First one is deployment frequency, which is how often an organization successfully releases into production. And for that, we just need our deployments table. So it's the simplest one to do. I will say a common mistake that I see is that people mistake volume and frequency. And so what we'll see is that somebody will look at the past month and they'll say, oh, we've had 30 deployments in the past month. So that's an average of 1 per day. So we are deploying daily. But when you start to actually like look at the data, then you'll see that actually those 30 deployments happen on 2 different days. So you're only deploying bi-weekly, not daily. And this is why you have to count like the days that have deployments rather than the number of deployments. The number of deployments is not as useful. We want to know frequency. Okay, so next we have lead time to change, which is the amount of time it takes a commit to get into production. And for that, we need our deployments and we need the list of all the changes in the deployments so that we can compare those timestamps. Important note is that for all of these metrics, we're using median because they're not normal distributions, and averages tend to, when you have outliers, your averages can be like wildly skewed. And we're trying to get at like what the typical experience is, what like the general activity is rather than the average, which when you take an average, you end up with a number that maybe never happened. So we want the median. And in the dashboard, in the FourKeys project dashboard, we have these little badges that we color code according to the DORA research. And in this case, a median lead time to change of a week is median performance. And so yellow badge. Okay, next is change fail rate, which is the percentage of deployments causing a failure in production. So we're talking about rates. We need a denominator, we need a numerator. Our denominator is the total number of deployments, and our numerator is the total number of incidents. So ideally, you would know which deployments caused which incidents. This data can be sometimes hard to get, depending on the systems that you're using. Sometimes it can be hard to like nail down like what the actual root cause was, in which case you'd have to just use like timestamps. Okay, next is time to restore. Again, we need incidents and deployments. Same 2 tables. This time we are looking at the timestamp of ideally the deployment that caused the incident to the time it was resolved. Sometimes that data is not available, in which case we would default back to the time that the incident was detected. The reason we care about when the incident was caused versus detected is because all of these metrics, like we're considering how the user, the end user, the customer is experiencing this. So if there was a week between when the incident started to when it was detected, that means that your customers were, suffering and having some pain for that week. And we want to know that, and we want to know, are there ways that we can close this gap? Okay, this is our dashboard, FourKeys dashboard. Around the corner, we have these like running daily logs. That's not in the research. The reason why we have that there is this hypothesis that it would be useful to have like an early check on the way your performance is trending as you're doing these different experiments to try to improve your 4 key metrics, which we have right down the center there, categorized via the DORA research. And anti-patterns. Okay. It's important to use this to improve your own performance. When we start, comparing teams, it's not always super useful because they have different constraints, different systems, different tech debt, and also like, one of the really important things that we see in the research is like how important psychological safety is. So like when you start like sticking people on each other, it doesn't turn out very well. I like to think of it, I use this analogy all the time. I like to think of it like, like a scale, and it doesn't matter if where I start on that scale, like if I, step on the bathroom scale, all that matters is that I am making progress in the direction that I am interested in, rather than me like going over to somebody else and saying, hey, what's your number? That doesn't do anyone any good. Okay, and the next thing we want to avoid is Taylorism. So there's, I think it's Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So the metrics are not the goal is to improve your performance, not to improve your metrics. The metrics should reflect your performance. But when we get so obsessed with the number, we can start to do things that are not desirable, that are, you know, like kind of skirting the issue, that are frankly cheating. And then we miss the opportunity to actually improve our performance. And that's a shame. So, you know, like a good way to do this is to have very like process oriented goals. Like, we're gonna like try this new system and we're gonna do XYZ, and then you are like through that time measuring your success on this experiment of like saying, did we do these things? Are we doing it? And then you use the 4 key metrics to determine whether or not that was a good strategy. And so the accomplishment is the testing of the hypothesis in that case. And it's actually really useful if you find that it was a bad strategy, because then you can share that information with other people in your company, in your organization, and maybe they can avoid, you know, going down that same path. We save everybody time, we save everybody money. And that is, yeah, that is how we like to approach using the metrics. Okay. Perfect. Tried to go real fast.
Hey, that was great. And I really appreciate the listing of the Antipatterns there, because I have pretty neat projects where once metrics became the goal, it led to a whole series of just bad decisions around how to game the metrics to our advantage. And your points about psychological safety are spot on, because as soon as this becomes some sort of performance management issue, it ceases to result in the kinds of discussions that you want to have. So thank you so much for pointing out both of those anti-patterns. That's those are really key things to remember. And thank you so much for the presentation. Nick Pinston, thank you for being here. How are you today?
Not too bad. Thank you very much.
Excellent. How would you like to introduce yourself? Maybe tell us a bit about your background and how you think about metrics of DevOps in general, and how it ties into overall strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So hello, everyone. My name's Nick Benson. I lead cloud engineering, and I also head up the cloud COE in our enterprise cloud computing here in Fidelity. And again, when we think of transformations and digital transformations, as Dina alluded, you know, it's a core part of really driving that transformation. And I think, you know, when we think of the relevance of those metrics, you know, for big organizations, particularly going through that transformation, and particularly when you think of tech transformation that enables that, and particularly say what I'm involved today is a key part of that, right, for the cloud. What you can see is, you know, as part of that transformation, you're going to have teams, you know, going at different speeds, and, you know, each one of their contexts are different. So you're going to have teams on one side of the spectrum beginning to understand about automation, cloud engineering, you know, agile ways of working, you know, breaking down those silos. And then on the other scale side, you can have teams that are already in the cloud building highly resilient systems, you know, really mature in relation to agile ways of working. And then you have all these teams in the middle, which, you know, are on that journey. So one of the challenges you often see then is, how do you give that guiding light to those teams that is uniform in relation to driving that improvement? You know, and Dina talks some of those aspects. And for what we see is, and particularly what I've seen in my own career, is that, you know, the DORA metrics, and, you know, if we put in availability on top of those, you know, are really great enablers for driving that culture. And particularly, you know, in the work that I've been doing, you know, there's two kind of key areas, you know, I see it really impactful. One is driving metrics from output-driven metrics to outcome-driven metrics. And what I mean by that is that these metrics are, even though they're IT related metrics, they're also business impacting metrics, which is often a big shift, right? Because you see a lot of IT metrics is for IT and they sit with IT, where these really transverse the organization. So when we think about business agility, these really have a direct impact. So when we think about, you know, we want to get fast feedback. We want to be able to pivot on that feedback. We want to experiment more. You know, you're going to want to invest in the capabilities that really enhance your deployment frequency and say your lead time, for example. And that's really powerful to have that from an organizational perspective. Another lens is around the simplicity. I think, John, you mentioned it on your intro there, because they're a set of 4 metrics, or 5 if you tack on availability. So, it really helps to, articulate it easily across an organization. You don't have this bag of metrics that, or some big pyramid of metrics that you have to transverse to get to the outcome. This simplifies it. It means no matter what your domain is in a very large organization, you can understand the impact. So when we think of going back to the culture piece, you want autonomy in your teams. So we want to empower teams to drive forward, but you also want to align them to the overall strategy. These metrics really help, drive that culture forward.
And so they help to tell you whether or not your metrics are meeting the mark as far as like culture, strategy, and driving towards the outcomes.
Yeah, and I think they provide that guiding light, because it is difficult, right? And again, when you think of that spread and spectrum of teams and where they're on a journey, how do I know I'm moving in the right direction? And having that holistic approach from an organization really uniforms it, right? And Dean, you were mentioning about being able to tell your teams and be able to share those experiences. You create that kind of common language then based off that.
One thing that comes up immediately as I look at the video, I noticed that both of you have much better lighting than I do. So I need to take a lighting tutorial from you so I can not look like a zombie in these things. Anyway, be that as it may, getting back to the topic at hand. Thank you for chiming in and giving us a bit of a background on where you're coming from and sort of the goals that you're striving for. And thank you for the DORA +1. When you think of the 5 metrics, when you think of availability. So there are a few questions that have been popping up into the chat, but I'll go to those in a second. But I guess what I wanted to start off with, after we've had the introductory period is why don't we start with something fun? Why don't we talk about a time where a metrics project didn't go so well? Not naming names, of course, because this is a blameless postmortem. But what are some things that you've seen that where the best practices you talked about earlier weren't followed, and what were the outcomes as a result? And I'm assuming that for everyone listening, I'm assuming that everyone here has read Measure What Matters, or at least are aware of the subject matter of Measure What Matters, measuring outcomes versus outputs. And thank you for delineating that, Nick. Especially as it ties into things like key metrics and how you're trying to drive towards that. But what's an instance from that you've seen from your background where things didn't align the way they should have, and how did that happen? And either of you can take that if you want.
Yeah, I can maybe chime in, and it's actually, I think, goes back to Dina's last slide when you talk about those antipatterns.
Antipatterns, yes.
Right. So, and again, when you think of the challenge of rolling out any metric set, FourKeys or otherwise, that comparison. And again, if I take the lens of, my intro there, when I talked about the different journeys that each team is going on through a transformation, if you really want to get that full adoption, comparison is going to really hinder you in relation to that movement, right? You don't want teams that are beginning the journey being compared to some team that have been out in the cloud for the last couple of years. So that's definitely, when we think about that adoption, everyone wants to be measured and get that, that silver bullet in relation to where we're going. But again, the culture of empowerment and direction is key. And I think regardless of what you're measuring, when we think about the cultural change and how we want to drive software performance, that I think is the foundation stone to getting at least the first step right.
No, it makes sense. Dean, I don't know if you have a war story you would like to share. I mean, those anti-pattern comments have to come from somewhere.
So many.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to choose them. So it's very easy for people to lose track of the point of the metrics, and the metrics become the point, especially when your personal performance bonuses, everything is wrapped up with it in it. And, you know, something I've seen on past teams, not naming any names, is like, for instance, we would have like a target to, we have like SLOs for our like bugs and priorities, and we had to like respond within a certain time. And then what you see is like people just downgrading the bugs that they didn't answer in time, not because they should be downgraded, just so that their numbers look better. Or we had like a thing that was supposed to be a quality measurement, and like one of the proxies for measuring quality was like, if multiple people made the same decision on it, like it's like a ticket, right? And so like it comes in and like multiple people make the same decision on it, and then that's like considered good quality. And then what that ends up being is actually a consistency metric, not a quality metric. So we just see people like enforcing the same wrong decision over and over again because you know, they feel like they'll get in trouble, or like people will get angry at them. Like, these are your coworkers, and like you know, made it so that I had 3 bad qualities this week, and now I have to do this like other training, and I'm not going to get my bonus.
It's very difficult. Actually, that leads to the question of like, and I would put that in the category of humans going to human. But guys, the question is like, is it possible to create a system of metrics without introducing the system of gamification? Or I guess a better way to phrase that would be, you know, gamification is something that is used on a regular basis. Can you use something like that without resulting in the anti-pattern that we're describing here?
Yeah, but I think it needs to be done just like, because sometimes gamification is great. Sometimes like it just has really good results. But you need to either very tightly align the thing that you're gamifying, or it needs to be at like different levels, and so that it's kind of hard to express this. Okay, a thing that's like you gamify well, like step counters, right? Like the thing that you're measuring is just your step count. So you go out, you make more steps. Like you don't. Like, what do you abuse it? Like, probably not. Like, you're just going to take more steps. It's great. And then what we saw, like, we're talking to a company recently that did like DevOps gamification, and one of the things that I liked about the way that they approached it was they gamified these lower level events, like build time and all these things that like are not the DORA metrics, but are the things that like if you improve, the DORA metrics will improve. So it's basically having the thing that you're measuring your success be different related to, but different from the thing that you are directly gamifying.
Interesting.
Yeah,
so
I think, John, can I just add to Dina? I think when you think about the gamification, even at a micro level, again, there's the risk of comparison and not having the context, right? So if every team is the same and doing the same thing, fine. But, you know, when you think of organizations, that's not the case. So even, you know, when you're driving those practices, and the context can be slightly different, right? I can be a platform team or an API team, or, hey, I write CLIs. They're very, very different. And therefore, you know, even at the micro level, so you're driving a risk then to the behavior you're going to instill can be a negative behavior, and ultimately not drive the cultural change. And that's when, you know, why I mentioned the cultural change. You know, fundamentally, you want people to have transparency and openness in an organization, and to be okay with showing red as well as green, and being okay to see the shift, and it's the trend. And, you know, to be, you know, sometimes you go from red to green and you get the green, and then the metric changes. You know, I'm a huge fan of one metric that matters, the OMTM concept, where a team might, as part of a transformation or anything, focuses on a single thing. It goes green, but then it goes amber again, because the line has shifted again for that team.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. You know, and you brought up another interesting point when you talk about, you know, when you mentioned things that we should be measuring, and I started thinking around how do you ultimately form a consensus around the things that you're going to track? So, when you think about all the stakeholders in sort of a modern software context or modern delivery team context, you've got the developers themselves, you've got various executives with visibility, you've got your central teams, you've got your continuous integration teams themselves, then you have like the delivery teams out on the periphery of that. Then you have like others like legal, risk management, a bunch of other people that have a stake in making sure that things are working as expected. How do you bring together such a diverse set of stakeholders and decide on these are the things that matter to us, and these are the things that we're going to use to measure success or progress? I guess measuring progress is better than measuring success, because success automatically tilts us towards the realm of metrics good, these metrics good, those metrics bad. But how do you bring together such a diverse group of people to decide on like the right strategy to go forward with?
That's a great question.
Oh, come on. I know you've dealt with diverse stakeholders before.
What we see has worked well in organizations is communities of practice. So that is definitely a good approach. Then there's sometimes people will do proof of concept role. You have one person in each of these roles that come together, join a team, and then they break off and then try to spread the word into other teams. That has some success, not generally as consistent as communities of practice. Ultimately it's just hard because people are people, and people, especially once you start getting metrics involved in it and start putting numbers and numbers that are opinionated, that say you're not doing as well as you can. If somebody has a preconceived notion that they're the best in the world, they might not take that very well. And it can be good to have a neutral party facilitating this meeting, because then you can start to have a blameless culture. Everyone's on their best behavior because there's a facilitator who's joining the people together and trying to show them we all share responsibility for this thing. So it's really important that we understand that there's problems. Maybe the software developers might be saying, hey, we're getting our changes in, you're taking forever to roll them out. And then the ops people might be coming back and saying, hey, well, your architecture is so tightly coupled that we can't, it has to take forever to roll out. And at that point, you have to understand the decisions that you make over here affect the people over here, and pointing fingers doesn't help.
I think to add, John, there, I think why are we doing it in the first place, right? Start with the why, the how and the what follows later. I think it's important that everyone is on the same page as the why we're focused on this, and once you have that baseline, the conversation is a little bit easier. There's obviously lots of different dynamics in relation to rolling it out and driving that adoption, and particularly elements of culture and the whole change. But starting with the why is, I think, a critical bedrock to get everyone aligned to what we want to achieve. And I think, too, is when you think about those outcomes, demonstrating the outcome, again, we don't want to just throw it out to the whole organization. How is this going to work? And demonstrate it working. There's nothing more powerful, I think, than seeing something adding value and it works end to end. It's not just some PowerPoint or some, slide somewhere that's saying this is a great idea. And everyone else is using it, so we should.
And then we can start talking about canary deployments and how they can be useful to drive the discussion across an organization. You've referenced culture change a few times, and I guess I'd really like to get into that part of this discussion around, avoiding the situation where measurements become the goal and thinking more about what the goals in an organization are. What are some things that you found work to frame the discussion around, hey, we need to drive towards this set of goals? Or how do we even use metrics as a way to frame the discussion around goals? And when you think about organizational change, or to point out places where maybe the culture doesn't facilitate the right kind of collaboration, how can you use metrics to really force that discussion in a way that is blameless and productive and pushes things in a positive direction?
Yeah, I think first is about the transparency that it brings.
Yeah.
So often, particularly when you talk about practices for engineering, it's a very opinionated space. We all have very strong opinions. What is great,
I
right?
don't know what you're talking about.
Right. And again, the data helps you, going back to the outcome, what are we trying to achieve? And, dispel of the opinions. And, I just saw one of the questions there on, I think, talking about the practices. It then allows you to focus on what practices can enable that change, without, again, being opinionated. Oh, TDD is an awesome idea. Truck development, let's all do it. But that's maybe not what's going to be your biggest constraint right now. And again, it just dispels of, all of those opinions coming into the melting pot to make the metrics useful versus just some number that we're tracking and, it has no real impact on what we're doing.
I mean, that's, I think, one of the things.
Yeah, and Dina, you mentioned community. Sorry, go ahead.
One of the things that I really love about the DORA research is because there's thousands of metrics that you could be looking at, and often you don't know. Like, we use a lot of things that are just like proxies for other things, and we don't know if they actually correlate or if they're actually predicted. We just think maybe they are. And having something to look at and say, hey, this has been validated via research, this has been peer reviewed, like this is a starting place that we can probably all agree on.
You mentioned communities of practice a minute ago as a way to help facilitate those types of discussions. If our listeners or viewers wanted to learn more about communities of practice and where to get started, where's a good resource of information for that?
The 2019 State of DevOps report has some information about communities of practice. I think Accelerate does as well. And I think our DevOps cloud.google.com/DevOps probably has something about it. But the general idea is that if you have a top-down strategy, it's usually not flexible enough to actually be successful because, as Nick said, like the teams are all working on different products and are all at different points in the DevOps journey. Right. And then also like things change quickly. And so each team needs to have the flexibility to pivot and put the strategies in place that work for them. And the great things about communities of practice is that like all the teams are they're doing that, and then they're sharing with each other, where they've had success, where they've had failures, what they've found useful.
Yeah, and I think to add John, where we've seen a lot of success with community of practice, the tacit knowledge spread, things that are often buried in a team or buried in someone's mind, to be able to share and generate that sense of community, which is, again, fundamental when you think of these type of changes that we want to initiate. It really helps spread that knowledge. And again, when you think of best practice and, it kind of then a lot of the best practices start filtering up through teams without, being hardcore standards being pushed straight down. You often see the best things bubbling up and creating those connections. You think about everyone's on video today, with the pandemic. How do you, creating those connections are even more important today, right? If you're not in the office. So you don't have those water cooler moments in the office to be able to talk through things or someone you haven't met in those collisions. Now, community of practice, I think, are a really great way to generate those collisions and sharing different ideas and perspectives and spread that knowledge around.
Actually, so you're coming from Fidelity. You're also in a highly regulated environment like me. And Dina brought up a good point, which was around, top down versus, I guess for lack of a better word, bottom up. How do you negotiate that difference between top down and community of practice model? Because it feels like there's a bit of a disconnect there in how those models can work. And I'm going to assume that you've had to kind of navigate that contention. So I'm curious how you address it or how you have addressed it in the past.
Yeah, I think it's a journey when we come from traditional way of working to new way of working. So like in my opinion, really the strength is again going back to the why we want this to happen.
Mm-hmm.
When we think of, the engineering experience, we think of talent, we think of development talent, we think of how fast, our industries are moving now. Financial services was probably
Right.
once a slow moving ball down up a hill. Now
Yes.
it's like rolling down the hill really fast. We got to be able to pivot really quickly. So many of the issues that, let's say pure technology teams had previously, financial
Yeah.
service industries now have to, obviously enable them. So I think there's a cultural shift too, but, there's always a balance in an organization. But, when it comes to initiating that culture of sharing, collaboration, empowerment, and again, it's just the guardrails in which you work in, right? And I think once they're defined, you don't want to stifle innovation by putting too much top down. You want people to innovate. You want people to be, collaborative across the bound. So, to go back to your question, that's been a journey. What I've seen working in Fidelity and other places is, that open and transparent, need to change the culture and bringing a lot of things we've talked about today into the organization to truly shift it. And again, why are we doing it? Going back to the why. Why is this important? Why do we need to change? And why do we need to, embrace, cultures like DevOps and, bring things like SRE in and so on and so forth, right? They're critical to our business, not just for IT, right?
Yeah, and whenever you talk about culture change and how and systems and implementing systems and the organizations in which they're implemented, inevitably you come to Conway's law about how the systems you implement end up being a reflection of the culture from which it sprang, the organization from which it came. And then I guess the question is like, how do you use metrics to try to get ahead of that, or can you get ahead of that? And if you have experiences from your background where you've seen metrics lead to the right kind of questions that help to drive cultural change, I would love to hear something along those lines to give people hope if they're watching and not very happy with their current predicaments. That what's an instance where this has worked out to actually force that kind of change?
Yeah, maybe if I can jump in first, Dean, if you don't mind, where, again, going back to how we even frame the problem and the why. So we talk about enabling these metrics and, at the macro level, these are really important. They're organizational. We're wanting to drive change also at the micro level within the teams themselves and how they deliver software, how they construct software, their architecture, so the macro level allow us to understand, are we moving the dial? Are we moving forward? Yeah. But we still, depending on your context, where do I start? I think you mentioned a company you were working with, understanding, the gamification of what at the micro level is, when we focus on the macro, we also want to think about the micro. And, when we think of empowering the teams with data to be able to find that top constraint, go after that, but drive best practice of engineering through that data and then see it being reflected at the macro level. And that's kind of one way that I started looking at this problem, that, it's a two-tier thing. It's one at the organizational level to be able to drive that change, but you also have to think about the team. You can't just leave them feeling around in the dark, right? In relation to how do I change lead time? And particularly if you're beginning this journey, and the same, even if you're a very mature team, you're not done because you're in the cloud or, you're building resilient systems. There's always room for improvement, but the context is different. And how do you guide teams and focusing on the best practices, the engineering excellence? Part of my role now is the pursuit of mastery of software craft. These are all the things now which have become important to really drive the change both at a micro and a macro level.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can all agree that delivery teams should not have to fumble around in the dark, but I think we can all think of times where that's actually happened. Sorry, Dina, did you have something to?
John Mark, I'm going to jump in because I'm going to take questions.
Sorry.
I know you're hogging the questions here.
No, I'm sorry. Actually, there was one that came up as far as and a couple actually have come up around what, how do you start the clock? What does lead time mean? Do you start from the first commit? How do you define that?
Yeah, you want to start from the first commit if you can. We find that the longer code just stays in the pipeline, the more instability we see, the more incidents we see. Your batches start getting bigger, which means that it's harder to isolate and test all the changes that are going into it. So, and also like we want to consider these metrics. They're predictive of all these business outcomes. So we're talking about business outcomes, and so we are considering that the customer is waiting for us to build these features and push this stuff, and we want to know how quickly and how well we're doing that, and thus we would like to start with our first commit.
Cool. Okay. An interesting question here, because it's an area that I'm not familiar with. What do you think of the flow metrics, flow efficiency, flow time, flow load, flow velocity, flow distribution, and their value in DevOps? And I guess either of you can take that. If you're familiar with it, great. If not,
I was wondering about, I'm not familiar with that.
No. All right, we'll take that under advisement to figure out a response for. Hang on. Okay, so Dina, you described deployment frequency as days having deployment. What about deployment per developer per day? Is that still deployment per developer per day? Is that still a useful metric?
I'm not. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Is it so? Are you saying like that a developer deployed once per day?
I mean, it feels like there's if you look at deployments per developer per day, something like that. Like I guess it depends on how you're measuring the
I see.
what you're using to define the
I see. I mean,
I like how Kenny has asked. Kenny, can you say a bit more? Is that something you've used maybe drop something in the chat? Is it something you've used specifically?
I've invited Kenny on stage if he wants to come on stage.
Yeah, I'm just thinking when you think of a metric like that, if you focus on what happens if you're doing pair programming, who does the commit, right? There's patterns of work that, one is the question is what's the outcome you want to achieve by measuring that, and two, if you're pair programming, etc., that might be something difficult to even understand, right?
Okay, Kenny's here.
Wow, very exciting.
Kenny.
Thanks for taking the question. The metric deployment per developer per day was defined in the Accelerate book. And so, again, an average, and Dean, I appreciated you pointing out, hey, average may not be great. Median also may not always be great. Counting how many days you're actually deploying maybe to production is interesting. So we've been chasing some of the deployment per developer per day. And what we found interesting is corporate onboards like agencies full of developers, that number drops very quickly. They think that by adding more developers, you automatically get an increase in frequency, and that's not necessarily the case. So I was wondering if you're seeing if that's
yes, the mythical man month.
A useful metric still, or not a useful metric, or just different metrics.
I would say just different metrics, and I would never tell anybody that like a metric is not useful if it's useful to you. I like to think of like there's almost like metric placebo. If it drives real performance improvements, then I think use it. But back to like when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So I think the nice thing about the FourKey metrics is they're predictive of success, and they're at this like macro level. So like if you're using this and you find that it is correlating and it's improving your deployment frequency, then by all means keep using it. If it's not, then maybe that's a time to step back and consider like, is this a good strategy? Is this helping us? We're not seeing the business outcomes that we want to see.
Yeah, and I just to add, Kenny, maybe to the right, when I mentioned about pair programming what is the effect of measuring it? To your point, Nina, is could it have a negative effect? Maybe some of the ways you want to work, it's going to hinder you working that way because now you're measuring at an individual level rather than deployments to development or QA or whatever, right? Which is more a team task.
So this next question, I think, is
thank you, Kenny.
Thank you, guys.
Sorry. No worries. Sorry. Thank you, Kenny. I thought he was going to stay with us. Anyway, no worries. I love this question because it gets to the heart of like, hey, do we really need to do this? Which I'll be honest, a lot of times when I'm presented with metrics projects, the first question I ask is, do we really need to do this? How important is it to actually measure these metrics as opposed to just working with the relevant principles that we know improve performance? And that gets to the heart of really the why, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if I want to understand the question fully in relation to when I talked about the micro, is when we think about practices and principles, that's where we're targeting at that level, but we're using the macro as a way to understand a business agility, and what we're doing has an outcome to the business, not just technology. So, and that's where when I think about the micro, focusing on the practice and principles is fundamental. You want to be doing the right things, but which ones do you focus on now versus later? And that's going to depend on what your constraints are and, various other inhibitors. I think the comment, I think, is totally right. You should do that, but, the FourKeys allow you to understand the effect on, from an outcome perspective of moving the dial, right? Not every practice or principle will have the same effect depending on your context.
Yeah, it really helps you to prioritize.
Yep.
When you're looking at the outcomes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it gives you a way to test your hypothesis, because there's lots of different capabilities that you can be doing. There's lots of different strategies you can be implementing, and having something that you can go back to your hypothesis is that this will work and it will improve your business outcomes, but maybe a month down the line you find that that's not happening.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately there has to be some tie-in to core business value, right? Otherwise, why are you doing it? And if you can't demonstrate that, then either your process of measuring outcomes is wrong, or the thing that you're trying to do is not quite in the right direction.
Yeah.
Okay, just conscious of time, and we clearly should have scheduled a lot more time for this discussion. But I'll just take a few minutes to say thanks for the questions, and we'll hold on to those. So we're planning a write-up of the session, so there might be some of them we can address offline or follow up with you and cover that in the write-up. A quick point to the polls. Thanks, everybody, for filling those out. It would look like 70% of folks are not tracking DORA metrics. So that's interesting to see.
Yeah.
And we've got 10% who are doing 3 to 4, 11.5%, which is good. And then lots of interesting data as well on the snapshot of how the teams who are measuring are doing it. So we've got internal scripts, open source projects, and proprietary software.
Thank you. And that is an interesting poll result, especially does your team track DORA metrics? An overwhelming number saying no. I'm curious, I wasn't following the chat script, but I don't know if we put a link into the DORA site or the FourKeys site, just to make sure people have those resources on hand. Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you, Dina.
So yeah, I don't know if folks can stay on, but maybe for those who have to leave, if we can kind of do maybe closing thoughts and thank yous. And then anyone who can stay on, you're welcome to hang around in the chat and keep talking.
All right. Awesome.
Cool. I actually have to drop off in 2 minutes, but I do appreciate the invitation to staying longer.
The end came up suddenly here. Sorry.
Well, no, I mean, you could talk about this for literally hours, and maybe we should get some sort of informal I don't know, Twitch stream or Discord something going, so we can have a more fully fledged conversation with all the other participants. That would be kind of fun.
We have a Slack FourKeys channel if people are
Cool.
interested in joining and chatting there.
Yeah, I was going to
Fun.
mention also the CDF Slack. There's a channel for the end user council. So let us know.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Dina. I really appreciate your participation here. I think hopefully this has been useful for those following along. And I look forward to hearing from everybody in the comments, or maybe hopefully we'll see you in the Slack channel or at future end user council sessions. This has been fun. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.